All right, welcome back in Live Now. I'm Austin Westfall. There's a lot of news coming out of the Russia-Ukraine war as of late. Standing by to discuss is retired Marine Intelligence Officer, National Security Analyst, and host of the Strat Podcast, Hal Kempfer. As always, Hal, it's good to see you. There's some legislation that we're going to talk about in a moment here, but first, I got to start off with this massive drone attack. Russia firing 700-plus drones toward Ukraine. What I read is that this is one of the most intense aerial ground assaults in the 3-year war. And I read that NATO jets, Hal, were scrambled as a result of this attack. Why were NATO jets scrambled? Why did that have to happen?
Well, one of the problems is when they fire all these drones and stuff, some of them, and some of it may be because of electronic warfare, is they will overshoot their target. So Poland actually put some NATO jets, or well, they're jets in Poland, into the air, and that's basically to deal with the possibility of drones or missiles coming into NATO airspace. In some cases, there were actually missiles that were flying into NATO airspace and then out of NATO airspace in order to hit their targets. So that was one of the things that that they were looking at very closely. That's not just a problem that's up north. That's a problem that was seen previously down south in Romania as well, with some of these drones basically going either off course or their course literally deliberately took them over into NATO airspace. So that's why you saw that particular part of it. But this was huge. This was about almost 750. Mostly drones, but also a good number of missiles, to include those Iskander hypersonic missiles, which are so difficult to stop because of their incredible speed. And it caused a lot of destruction. I mean, overall, despite the brief stoppage in U.S. shipment of arms to Ukraine, they reportedly stopped 90% of those drones and missiles from coming in. However, you still see the dramatic impact. You know, when you have, say 90%, yeah, well, that still means about 75 made it through. And of course, it caused a tremendous amount of devastation. And you kind of see those pictures right here, the amount of problems that they're having. And by the way, the other issue is that this has become so routine that not everybody evacuates right away from their apartments or homes. They wait till they get the alert, and in some cases, they don't evacuate quite soon enough. So there's been loss of life because people were, in one case, they were literally alerting their neighbors that there was a drone alert coming in, and while they were alerting their neighbors, the drone actually hit right where that side of the building where they were at, and a husband and wife were killed. So it's pretty dramatic stuff what's going on.
Did Russia defend itself? Did Ukraine defend itself? Excuse me. Can you expand on that? 700 drones shot that way. Overall, would you say that they defended themselves?
I think they're doing an amazing job. You know, they're holding the line. One of the things is, they're making modest gains on the ground, if you will. If I could kind of shift gears and just talk to the ground, they're making modest gains in the east, in the Donbass. But Ukraine has actually gone back up into Sumy Oblast. They're actually making some gains up there. That's on Russian territory. So there's been the Ukrainians have done some pretty amazing things. They had a rather remarkable strike on a command post of a unit that was supposed to be like one of the lead units for pushing the offensive in the east, and that, of course, completely dissembled their offensive action, and it took out one of their key commanders, and they're really short on good military commanders right now. So that was a phenomenal strike that happened there. But they're trying to offset that. Interestingly, these strikes came right after, and some are calling it Putin's reply to President Trump, basically talking about Putin's comments, and let's just say I'll use the acronym BS, but he actually said the full word, which is not something you hear on television very often, but he actually said that, and it was pretty critical of Putin, and it was almost as if Putin's response was, okay, fine, I'll send this massive strike, the biggest missile and airstrike that you've seen during the war. And a lot of people, a lot of experts out there are noting that seems to be Putin's response to Trump's comments.
Let's talk about Congress. There's this bill that's being discussed. I got to also just say that Whoever operates this camera needs to turn the brightness up a little bit. It's looking a little darker than typical. It was like this last week. It still hasn't done. We might need to send in an order to get this thing fixed up. Anyway, Hal, that's Capitol Hill. It's usually a little bit brighter than that. There's a bill that both sides of the aisle are considering. It's a bipartisan bill that would sanction Russia over its war with Ukraine. Leader John Thune says that it's going to aim to enhance President Trump's leverage at the negotiating table and help end the bloodshed in Ukraine. That's a quote from Thune. There's no concrete timeline yet, though, on when this could get pushed through Congress, but there appears to be wide support for it. So how much venom do sanctions carry at this point toward Russia? How much damage could the U.S. do to the Kremlin with it?
If the bill is enacted, and I was hearing that Thune and Johnson were both talking, and there was some thought that they might be able to push this through with what they just heard President Trump say, that they might be able to get everybody together to vote this through both houses by the end of the month. That's a possibility. I'm not predicting anything. That's just what's being reported. As they said, it was possible they could move it through that quickly. This has, in the Senate, it has tremendous bipartisan support. I think there's over 80 senators who have said they're in favor of this bill. What it does is it sets up a regime of secondary sanctions. And we've done this before. We did this years back with Iranian oil. Very successful. The Indians were importing a lot of Iranian oil, and it puts a secondary tariff, if you will, on those countries that import oil. In this case, the oil would be from Russia, and oil and gas, I should say. And it has had effect in the past when it was used on another country in another situation. So it is a proven method for putting tremendous pressure on a country, and the effects it had on Iran actually changed Iran's behavior in a number of key ways. So if this were to happen, and there's talks of extremely high sanctions that could be placed on places like India and China for using Russian oil, that this could literally dry up the revenue sources that are paying. They're basically what Putin is using to pay for the war. So it could have, if it was fully enacted, a lot of power. With all of that said, there is a little escape clause in the bill, which allows the president discretion on whether to impose it or not impose it. So they could pass it. President Trump could sign it and then decide not to impose any of those secondary tariffs or those sanctions that are in the bill. So that's one scenario of how this thing could roll out.
So, Hal, up on the screen here, we see some reporting from the Washington Post. It says, after months of White House friendliness toward Moscow, President Trump and top Republicans have shifted course, with the White House preparing to send additional weaponry to Ukraine and Congress moving to enact tough new sanctions on Russia. Two things I want to ask you about. Is that a fair assessment? Months of friendliness toward Moscow from the White House? And two, how important would additional weapons be in Ukraine's fight?
Well, additional weapons will make a difference. The real big difference, of course, is going to be the Europeans stepping up, and the Europeans have been increasing about as fast as they can. Of course, I personally feel the biggest thing that could happen, but I'm not holding my breath, is that South Korea changes its policy and ships weapons to Ukraine. I think that could be really, really decisive in a number of areas, particularly in artillery ammunition, if they were to do that. But the U.S. sending weapons helps. One of the problems, and I'm not going to say, look, there's a lot of discussion. President Trump is saying that he didn't know, and essentially he doesn't really seem to care who actually shut down the Ukrainian arms shipments. A lot of fingers are being pointed at Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, I should say, that he did this on his own. There was other talk that somewhere within the Department of Defense that this may have been a decision that they misinterpreted the president's intent or went too far or something like that. But overall, there is a bit of truth in what they were saying, in that we don't have enough Patriot missiles. We don't have enough Patriot systems. In fact, they just completed a big review or war game, if you will, looking at what we would need if we were to, say, get into a big war with China and stuff like that. And we had about 25% of the Patriot missile systems that we need. which means that, yes, we do need air defense missiles, and supporting the war that Israel has been engaged with Iran and also its neighbors, like from coming from southern Lebanon with Hezbollah earlier, they've used up a lot of missiles. We've been supporting Ukraine for a very long time with Patriot missile systems. They've used up a lot of missiles, and we are short of missiles. We need more air defense systems. So, it's a long way of saying that what we're doing makes a big difference, but we are having to kind of balance our support with Ukraine with other commitments and other requirements around the world.
So, one last thing. You sent me some information this morning about the approximate Russian losses so far in this war. What are you taking away from the latest figures, and how do the Russian losses stack up to the Ukrainian losses?
Well, that's interesting. The Ukrainians don't publish their losses, and I have heard the Russian losses compared to the Ukrainians as 3-1. I've heard some which sound a little bit pro-Russian, that they were saying, oh, it's about 2-1. In other words, 2 Russians killed and injured for every Ukrainian. The Ukrainians are taking huge losses. It's not entirely clear how many they have lost. The Ukrainian medical system is much, much better than the Russian system. So when there's Russian injuries and they go into their medical system, the chances of them ever returning to the battlefield drop commensurately, because they just don't have it. In fact, they were sending Russian soldiers to North Korea for medical treatment, and that is one of the most horrific concepts I've ever heard of, if you know anything about North Korean medicine. So it tells you just how bad the situation is with Russia. But they've lost over 1 million. I think it's like 1,030,000 men have been lost, killed and injured. About half of them killed, and those who are injured usually suffer debilitating injuries. And when they go back to Russia, they are not taken care of to any great degree. There's a lot of wounded, disabled veterans running around Russia who are just not getting the proper care and sustainment and medical care and everything else that they need. And that is weighing on Russian society. And that's being seen more and more. And then if you look at the number of tanks, armored vehicles, everything else that they've been losing, it is phenomenal. And frankly, the Russian Navy has taken enormous losses from a country, Ukraine, that doesn't have a Navy. And it's just stunning what they've been able to accomplish. So yeah, Russia's really been set back. If they lose that oil revenue with the losses they've suffered, folks are looking at saying, well, not only can't Putin pay for the war, but they're having a tough time imagining Putin staying in office much longer.
Looking over some of the numbers that you sent me earlier today from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, we're talking about 1,029,000 losses as far as troops go, 11,000 tanks, 30,000 artillery systems, much, much more, 421 aircraft. Hal Kempfer, we will leave it there for now. Retired Marine Intelligence Officer Hal Kempfer is the host of the Strat Podcast. You can listen to it anywhere podcasts are available. Good to see you, Hal. We'll talk soon.
Good to see you, Austin.